Remember the smell of cinnamon and vanilla filling your grandmother's house the week before Christmas?
Back then, we didn't just bake for Christmas. We built it, one dessert at a time.
In 1950, 30 homemade desserts transformed ordinary kitchens into holiday wonderlands. These weren't dessert, they were edible celebrations, the sweet finale to every Christmas gathering. Today they've vanished because we're forgetting what made Christmas desserts worth the wait. We're racing to capture all 30 before the last grandmothers who baked them die, and share this with the one person you wish could be in the kitchen with you, cooking these forgotten Christmas desserts together like we used to. Walk into Grandma's kitchen on December 20th, 1958, when making dessert was an all-day commitment and nobody complained about the wait. Rainbow Jell-O wasn't something you whipped up in an hour. This was architecture made from gelatin, patience, and a refrigerator that got opened and closed 20 times by curious grandchildren. She'd start early in the morning with the bottom layer, mixing cherry Jell-O with boiling water and pouring it into her best glass dish. Into the fridge, it went for exactly 1 hour until it set firm. Then came the cream layer, lemon Jell-O mixed with cream cheese beaten smooth, poured gently over the red so it wouldn't break through, back into the fridge, then orange, then another cream layer, then lime. By evening, 7 distinct stripes stood tall in that glass dish, and when she carried it to the table, everyone would gasp. It wobbled like it might collapse, but never did. Rainbow Jell-O meant someone loved you enough to spend an entire day making dessert. Step back to Christmas Eve, 1954, when Grandma would bring out a dessert so rich and sweet that kids were only allowed 1 small serving, or they'd be bouncing off the walls until midnight. Heavenly Hash was marshmallows, maraschino cherries, pineapple chunks, and pecans folded into fresh whipped cream that Grandma had beaten by hand until her arm ached. Some neighbors added coconut, but Grandma said that was showing off. The mixture would chill in a cut glass bowl overnight, and by Christmas morning the marshmallows had softened slightly, releasing their sweetness into the cream. The cherries turned everything faintly pink. The pineapple added juice that made each spoonful slip down easy. You'd eat it from small crystal dishes with tiny silver spoons, and it tasted like clouds mixed with candy. Heavenly Hash was pure indulgence, the dessert you made when sugar wasn't rationed and life felt abundant. Now people think it's too sweet, too simple. They're wrong on both counts. Picture: December 1st, 1959, when Grandma started her fruitcake a full month before Christmas because proper fruitcake couldn't be rushed and tasted better the longer it aged. She'd chop candied cherries, pineapple, citron, and dates into tiny jewels, then mix them with pecans and walnuts until her biggest bowl overflowed with color. The batter was thick with flour, butter, brown sugar, eggs, and enough spices to make the whole house smell like Christmas had moved in permanently. After baking for 3 hours at low temperature, the cake would come out dark and dense as a brick. Then came the magic part. She'd wrap it in cheesecloth soaked in whiskey and store it in a tin, adding more whiskey every week. By Christmas, that cake was moist and boozy and complex, tasting like fruit and nuts and time itself. 1 thin slice was enough. 2 slices meant you'd be giggling through dinner. Fruit cake was adult dessert. Go back to Christmas, 1956, when desserts had names that sounded like poetry, and recipes that required techniques your hands had to learn through failure. Snow pudding was made from lemon juice, sugar, gelatin, and egg whites, beaten until they formed stiff peaks that looked like fresh snow on a mountain. Grandma would fold everything together gently so the air wouldn't escape, then pour it into a mold and let it set for hours in the coldest part of the refrigerator. The result was white and fluffy and tart, melting on your tongue like flavored snow. But snow pudding needed its partner to be complete. Custard sauce made from egg yolks, milk, sugar, and vanilla, cooked slowly until it thickened into liquid gold. She'd pour the warm custard over the cold white pudding right at the table, and the contrast of temperatures and textures made your mouth wake up and pay attention. This wasn't simple dessert. Walk into a December afternoon in 1953, when dates came in boxes with pictures of palm trees on them and seemed exotic and expensive, even though they cost 50 cents. Date nut roll was Christmas candy disguised as dessert, and making it required strong hands and patience with sticky situations. Grandma would cook chopped dates with sugar and a little water until they turned into a thick, dark paste that stuck to everything it touched. Then came the walnuts, stirred in while the mixture was still hot, and she'd work fast because once it started cooling, it would become impossible to shape. She'd dump the whole mass onto a dish towel dusted with powdered sugar, then roll it tight into a log while it was still warm enough to cooperate. After it cooled completely, she'd slice it into rounds that looked like pinwheels, dark date spirals wrapped in white sugar coating. Each slice was dense and chewy and tasted ancient, like something from the Bible lands where dates grew wild. We'd eat one piece and feel satisfied for hours. Re-hook, wait right there. Those 5 desserts were just the warm-up, the ones Grandma made when she had a regular week to prepare. The next 25 get more complicated, more time-consuming, more impressive. Number 13 required a technique so precise that 3 out of 4 attempts would fail completely. Stay with me. The real baking mastery is just beginning, and you need to see what our grandmothers could do with nothing but a Betty Crocker cookbook and determination. Step into Christmas 1962 when Grandma decided to show off for the relatives visiting from California, and she made the one dessert that seemed physically impossible: ice cream covered in cake, covered in meringue, then baked in a hot oven without the ice cream melting. Baked Alaska was magic disguised as dessert, and the first time you saw it, you couldn't believe your eyes. She'd bake a thin layer of cake the day before, then cut it to fit her best serving platter. On Christmas afternoon, she'd pile brick ice cream onto that cake, vanilla, chocolate, and strawberry stacked high. Then came the meringue, beaten from egg whites and sugar until it formed glossy peaks that held their shape. She'd spread that meringue over the entire ice cream tower, sealing every bit so no ice cream showed through. Into a blazing hot oven it went for exactly 3 minutes, while we all held our breath. The meringue would toast golden brown, while the ice cream stayed frozen inside because meringue insulates like magic. When she carried it to the table with the peaks, all golden and beautiful, everyone would applaud. Baked Alaska meant your grandmother was fearless and skilled and willing to risk disaster for the sake of impressing guests. Most people never attempted it. The ones who did earned legendary status. Go back to Christmas 1957 when elegant desserts had French names that nobody could pronounce correctly, and Charlotte Russe was the fanciest thing most families ever served. This wasn't a dessert you made casually. This required ladyfinger cookies, which had to be either baked from scratch or bought from the one bakery in town that carried them. Grandma would line a special mold with those ladyfingers standing upright like soldiers, then fill the center with Bavarian cream she'd made from scratch, egg yolks, sugar, gelatin, and heavy cream whipped until it was lighter than clouds. The whole thing would chill overnight, and the next day she'd unmold it onto her crystal cake stand. The result looked like a fancy European pastry, the kind you'd see in magazine pictures of elegant parties. The lady fingers would be soft from absorbing moisture from the cream, and each slice revealed layers of cake and cream that melted together perfectly. Walk into Christmas morning 1951, when English traditions still meant something in American kitchens, and plum pudding was the dessert that connected us to ancestors we'd never met. Despite the name, there were no plums in plum pudding, just raisins, currants, candied peel, sweet, breadcrumbs, flour, eggs, spices, and enough brandy to make the church ladies whisper. Grandma would mix everything together weeks before Christmas, pack it into a pudding mold, then steam it for hours until it turned dark and dense as a cannonball. On Christmas Day, she'd steam it again to reheat it, then carry it to the table while it was still smoking hot. Sometimes she'd pour brandy over it and light it on fire, and we'd all watch the blue flames dance across the top while she smiled like a magician who'd just pulled off an impossible trick. The pudding itself was rich and fruity, and unlike anything else we ate all year, but it needed hard sauce to be complete. Picture Christmas Eve, 1958, when Grandma would pull out her cast-iron skillet and make the one cake that looked impressive, but was actually easier than it appeared. Pineapple upside-down cake started with melted butter and brown sugar in the bottom of that skillet, cooked together until they bubbled into caramel. Then came pineapple rings from a can, arranged in a pattern with maraschino cherries in the centers like red jewels. She'd pour yellow cake batter over everything, being careful not to disturb the fruit pattern, then bake it until the top turned golden. The hard part was flipping it. She'd let it cool for exactly 10 minutes, then put a plate on top of the skillet and flip the whole thing in one confident motion. When she lifted the skillet away, the pineapple and cherries would be sitting on top of the cake, glazed with that caramelized brown sugar that had soaked into the fruit. You'd serve it warm with whipped cream, and the combination of buttery cake, sweet pineapple, and caramel made you understand why this cake had been popular since the 1920s. Log step back to December 23, 1960, when Grandma would spend an entire afternoon making a dessert that looked like a log from the forest but tasted like chocolate heaven. The Yule log, or Bûche de Noël if you wanted to sound fancy, required making a thin chocolate sponge cake, spreading it with chocolate buttercream while it was still warm, then rolling it up tight like a sleeping bag. This was the tricky part. If the cake was too cool, it would crack and break, too warm, and the filling would melt and slide out. Grandma had done it enough times to know exactly when the cake was ready to roll. Once rolled, she'd frost the entire log with more chocolate buttercream, then use a fork to create bark texture in the frosting. She'd dust it with powdered sugar to look like snow, add a few marzipan mushrooms if she was feeling ambitious, and set it on a wooden board. The finished Yule log looked like art, like something that belonged in a fancy bakery window. But when you sliced into it, revealing the spiral of cake and cream inside, and took that first bite of chocolate, you understood why Grandma had spent all afternoon making it. This was love and skill combined, baked into the shape of tradition. 10 desserts down, and you're starting to realize these weren't just sweets. They were performances, proof that your grandmother had skills that took years to master. The next 10 desserts get even more technical, even more time-consuming. Keep watching. If these forgotten Christmas desserts brought back memories of Grandma's kitchen hit-like, subscribe to bring back the holiday recipes they don't teach anymore before they're lost forever. Walk into Christmas, 1959, when layered desserts proved you had time and patience and a refrigerator that worked properly. Triple-layer Bavarian cream was an engineering project disguised as dessert, requiring perfect timing and 3 separate batches of gelatin-based cream that had to set in precise sequence. Grandma would start early in the morning with the bottom layer, strawberry gelatin mixed with whipped cream and crushed strawberries, poured into her best glass bowl. Into the refrigerator it went for exactly 2 hours until firm enough to hold the next layer, but not so firm it wouldn't bond with what came next. Then came the middle layer, vanilla Bavarian cream made from scratch with egg yolks, sugar, gelatin, milk, and more whipped cream. She'd test the strawberry layer with her finger, and when it was just right, Step back to Christmas 1956 when cakes had names like they were Southern Belles at a cotillion and Lady Baltimore was the queen of them all. This wasn't simple cake. This was 3 layers of white cake with a filling so complex it required its own recipe and a full afternoon to prepare. Grandma would bake the cake layers first, getting them perfectly even and golden. While they cooled, she'd make the filling, a boiled frosting base mixed with chopped raisins, figs, pecans, and enough whiskey to make it interesting but not scandalous. Overcook it by 30 seconds, and you'd have sweet scrambled eggs. The island was meringue, egg whites beaten with sugar until they formed peaks, then poached gently in simmering milk until they puffed up like white clouds. They had to be lifted out carefully with a slotted spoon or they'd break apart. Finally came the caramel, cooked to exactly the right temperature, and drizzled over the meringue islands in thin threads that hardened into amber glass. The finished dessert looked like white islands floating in a pale yellow sea, drizzled with golden caramel. When you ate it, your spoon would break through the caramel with a crack, sink into the soft meringue, and reach the silky custard below. 3 different textures, 3 different temperatures, all working together perfectly. Floating island meant your grandmother had professional-level skills and wasn't afraid to attempt dishes that might fail spectacularly. Most women wouldn't even try it. Grandma made it every other Christmas just to remind everyone she could. Walk into Christmas afternoon, 1961, when Grandma brought out her special pudding mold and announced she was making steamed pudding, and all the kids would groan because steamed pudding sounded boring, but secretly we loved it. Cranberry steamed pudding was dense and moist and tart, nothing like regular cake, and it required a cooking method most modern kitchens have completely forgotten. She'd mix flour, sugar, molasses, eggs, and fresh cranberries into a thick batter, pour it into a greased pudding mold, then cover it tightly with a lid. The mold would go into a pot of simmering water that came halfway up its sides, and it would steam for 3 hours while the house filled with the smell of cranberries and molasses mixed together. The pudding would come out dark reddish-brown, studded with burst cranberries that had released their tart juice throughout. She'd unmold it onto a plate while it was still warm, and the surface would be slightly sticky and shiny. The texture was dense but not heavy, moist but not wet, and the flavor was complex, sweet from molasses, tart from cranberries, with a hint of spice that made it taste like Christmas. It needed hard sauce to be complete, that butter and sugar and brandy mixture that melted on the warm pudding and made each bite rich and satisfying. Steamed pudding took 3 hours of simmering and attention, which is exactly why nobody makes it anymore. They think cake is easier. They're right, but they're missing the point entirely. Picture Christmas, 1958, when pies had names that sounded like they required a culinary degree to pronounce, and Nesselrode pie was the most mysterious dessert in Grandma's repertoire. Most neighbors had never heard of it. The ones who had couldn't tell you what was in it. But Grandma had the recipe from her sister who'd lived in New York City for a year and came back with sophisticated tastes. Nesselrode pie was a chiffon pie, light and airy, set with gelatin, flavored with rum and chestnut puree that came in a can from the fancy store downtown. Finding that chestnut puree was half the challenge, making the pie was the other half. She'd make a graham cracker crust first, pressing it into her pie pan and baking it until golden. While it cooled, she'd make the filling. Egg yolks, sugar, gelatin, rum, chestnut puree, and maraschino cherries, all mixed together, then folded into whipped cream and beaten egg whites. The mixture would be light as air, but intensely flavored, nutty from the chestnuts, sweet from the cherries, boozy from the rum. Into the crust it went, then into the refrigerator to set for hours. The finished pie was pale tan-colored, smooth as silk, and tasted like something from a fancy restaurant. Nesselrode pie meant your grandmother knew about unusual ingredients and wasn't afraid to try recipes that most people had never heard of. It also meant she had connections to get chestnut puree, which was practically impossible to find outside major cities. Step back to Christmas Eve, 1955, when icebox cake meant something elegant and impressive, not the simple refrigerator dessert people make now with store-bought cookies. Grandma's Mocha icebox cake required making chocolate wafers from scratch, thin, crisp cookies that took 2 hours just for the baking. She'd make dozens of them, letting them cool completely while she prepared the mocha cream filling, whipped cream flavored with strong coffee and cocoa powder, sweetened just enough to balance the bitterness. Then came the assembly, standing those chocolate wafers on edge in a long row, spreading mocha cream between each one like mortar between bricks. The whole construction would go into the icebox overnight, and something magical happened while it chilled. The moisture from the cream would soften those crisp wafers into something cake-like, while the wafers would firm up the cream just enough to make it sliceable. By Christmas morning, she'd have what looked like a chocolate log striped with mocha cream. She'd frost the outside with more whipped cream and dust it with cocoa powder. And when she sliced it on an angle, each piece revealed beautiful diagonal stripes of cookie and cream. The texture was unlike any other dessert, not quite cake, not quite cookies, but something better than both. Mocha icebox cake proved that patience and refrigeration could transform simple ingredients into something extraordinary, but only if you planned a full day ahead and trusted the process completely. Go back to Christmas 1952, when custard was the base of half of all holiday desserts. And knowing how to make it without curdling separated good cooks from great ones. Boiled custard, though it was never actually boiled, that was just the name, was Grandma's signature Christmas dessert, the one she made every single year without fail. It was simple in ingredients but complex in technique: egg yolks, sugar, milk, vanilla, and a generous pour of cream sherry that made it special and adult. She'd cook everything in a double boiler, stirring constantly with a wooden spoon, watching for that exact moment when the mixture would thicken enough to coat the spoon, but not so much that it would start to scramble. The timing had to be perfect. Stop too soon, and you'd have sweet milk. Cook too long, and you'd have sweet scrambled eggs. But when she got it right, and she always got it right, the custard would be smooth as silk, rich as cream, sweet and boozy and vanilla-scented. She'd pour it into a cut glass pitcher and serve it in small crystal cups, and you'd sip it slowly, letting it coat your mouth with richness. Walk into Christmas, 1960, when Grandma decided to make the tallest, most impressive dessert she could imagine. And the lemon meringue tower was born from ambition and 3 dozen eggs. This wasn't regular lemon meringue pie. This was layers of meringue discs stacked high with lemon curd between them, topped with more meringue torched until golden. She'd start by drawing circles on parchment paper, then piping meringue into flat discs and baking them low and slow until they dried out completely and turned crisp as crackers. This took hours because meringue won't dry in a hot oven, only a warm one. While the meringue dried, she'd make lemon curd from scratch. Egg yolks, sugar, lemon juice, and butter cooked together until thick enough to spread. The assembly happened on Christmas morning. She'd place the largest meringue disc on a cake stand, spread it with lemon curd, add another disc, more curd, another disc, building upward until she had a tower 6 layers high. The outside got covered in soft meringue that she'd torch with a kitchen blowtorch until it browned in spots. The finished tower looked like something from a fancy pastry shop, and when she cut into it, each slice revealed stripes of white meringue and bright yellow lemon curd. The taste was pure lemon brightness, balanced by sweet meringue, crunchy layers alternating with smooth curd. This dessert took an entire day to make and required skills most people don't have. Grandma made it anyway because Christmas deserved extraordinary effort. Step back to Christmas, 1950, when mincemeat pie was traditional holiday dessert, and the real recipe, the old recipe, contained actual beef sweet and tasted completely different from the jarred mincemeat you can buy today. Grandma would make her mincemeat from scratch weeks before Christmas, mixing chopped apples, raisins, currants, citrus peel, brown sugar, spices, brandy, and finely chopped beef sweet. Suet is the hard fat from around beef kidneys, and it was essential to authentic mincemeat because it added richness and helped preserve the mixture. She'd pack it all into jars and let it age in the cold cellar, and by Christmas the flavors would have melded into something dark and complex and boozy. On Christmas Eve, she'd make pie dough and fill it with that aged mincemeat, creating a double-crust pie with vents cut in the top for steam to escape. The pie would bake until the crust turned golden and the filling bubbled out slightly at the edges. When you cut into it, the filling would be dark and chunky, smelling like Christmas spices and brandy. The taste was intense, sweet and tart and meaty all at once, with the suet adding richness you couldn't get from butter. Some people loved it, some people hated it. Nobody was neutral about mincemeat pie. Grandma made it because her mother had made it, and her mother's mother before that, going back generations to England where mincemeat actually contained minced meat and wasn't just fruit and spices. You can't make real mincemeat pie anymore because nobody sells beef sweet. The ingredient disappeared, and with it went the authentic taste of Christmas past. Go back to Christmas afternoon 1957 when Grandma would assemble her trifle in the big glass bowl so everyone could see the layers, and it would sit in the center of the dessert table looking impressive and elegant and completely achievable if you had enough time and the right bowl. Trifle was British dessert that had become American tradition, and it required components made separately, then assembled into something greater than the sum of its parts. She'd start with pound cake baked the day before, cut into cubes. Those cubes would go into the bottom of the bowl, then get soaked with sweet sherry until they were boozy and soft. Next came a layer of raspberry jam, spread carefully so you could see it through the glass. Then custard, real custard made from eggs and milk, not the instant kind, poured over everything while still warm. She'd let it cool completely, then add a layer of whipped cream on top, smoothed flat and perfect. The final touch was decoration: slivered almonds, candied cherries, and more whipped cream piped in rosettes around the edge. 20 desserts in, and you're seeing the pattern. These weren't quick weeknight sweets. These were projects that required planning days in advance, techniques that took years to master, ingredients that don't even exist anymore. The last 10 desserts are the most elaborate, the most time-consuming, the ones that defined Christmas in homes where baking was considered an art form. Number 27 will show you exactly why our grandmothers deserved more respect than they ever got. Stay with me to the end. Walk into Grandma's kitchen 3 days before Christmas, 1962, when she announced she was making a Yule log the proper French way, which meant it wouldn't just be a chocolate roll, it would be an edible work of art complete with meringue mushrooms, marzipan holly, and buttercream bark, so realistic you'd swear it came from the forest. This was the year Grandma decided to show off, the year she'd been collecting recipes from French cookbooks and wanted to prove she could execute fancy European desserts, as well as any pastry chef in Paris, despite never having left West Virginia. The process started with the mushrooms, made from meringue piped into stems and caps, baked until crisp, then assembled with melted chocolate acting as glue. She'd brush them with cocoa powder to make them look earthy and real. Next came the marzipan holly, almond paste colored green and shaped into leaves with red marzipan berries. Step back to Christmas 1958, when Grandma's friend returned from a trip to France with a recipe that sounded like poetry and tasted like almond heaven, wrapped in lady fingers and soaked in liqueur. Charlotte Malakoff wasn't in any Betty Crocker cookbook. This was haute cuisine, the kind of dessert served in Parisian restaurants to people wearing expensive jewelry. But Grandma got the recipe written on a napkin, and she was determined to master it even if it took 5 attempts and a small fortune in almonds and kirsch. The base of Charlotte Malakoff was almond cream, butter and powdered sugar beaten together for 20 minutes by hand until it turned white and fluffy as clouds, then ground almonds added along with kirsch. A clear cherry liqueur that cost more than Grandpa wanted to spend, but Grandma insisted was essential. The mixture had to be beaten to exactly the right consistency. Too soft, and it wouldn't hold its shape. Too firm, and it would be dense instead of airy. While the cream waited, she'd prepare the lady fingers, brushing each one with kirsch, diluted with simple syrup, enough to flavor them without making them soggy. The assembly required her special Charlotte mold, a cylindrical pan with straight sides. She'd line the bottom with a circle of parchment, then stand the soaked lady fingers upright around the inside edge, fitting them tightly so no gaps showed. The almond cream would be spooned into the center, smoothed flat, then more lady fingers laid across the top like a lid. Into the refrigerator it went for at least 12 hours, giving time for everything to set and the flavors to meld together. The next day came the moment of truth, flipping the mold onto a serving plate and praying it would release cleanly. When it worked, and after the 3rd attempt, it always worked for Grandma, the result was a tower of almond cream encased in lady fingers, elegant and impressive and tasting like almonds and cherries and butter and sophistication. She'd decorate the top with whipped cream rosettes and slivered almonds, and serve it in thin slices because the richness meant a little went a long way. Charlotte Malakoff was the dessert you made when you wanted to prove you knew about French cuisine, when you wanted to show that small-town American women could execute complex European recipes just as well as anyone in Paris. It required ingredients that were expensive and hard to find, techniques that took practice to master, and confidence that most cooks didn't have. But Grandma had all 3, and every year someone would ask for Charlotte Malakoff by name, and she'd smile and say she'd think about it, even though everyone knew she'd already decided to make it, because she loved having a signature dessert that nobody else could replicate successfully. Go back to Christmas, 1955, when Grandma spent 2 full days making a Hungarian torte that required 7 thin cake layers, chocolate buttercream, and a caramel topping that would shatter like glass when you cut into it. Dobos torte wasn't something you made casually. This was serious baking, the kind that required precision, patience, and a willingness to accept that your first attempt would probably fail and you'd need to try again. Grandma had tried twice before and ended up with disasters she fed to the chicken. The 3rd time, she got it right, and from then on, Dobos torte became her signature achievement, the dessert she made when she wanted to remind everyone exactly how skilled she was. The cake layers had to be paper thin, which meant baking them one at a time in round pans, only a 1/4 cup of batter per pan, spread edge to edge. Each layer baked for just 6 minutes, then had to be turned out immediately onto a towel to cool. 7 layers meant 42 minutes of active baking, standing at the oven, timing each one precisely. While they cooled, she'd make chocolate buttercream from scratch. Real butter, cocoa powder, powdered sugar, egg yolks, and vanilla beaten together until smooth and glossy. The buttercream had to be spreadable but not too soft, firm enough to support the layers, but not so stiff it would squish them when assembled. The assembly was its own kind of art. First layer down, thin spread of buttercream. Next layer, more buttercream, building upward until all 7 layers were stacked. The sides and top would get frosted smooth. Then she'd chill the whole thing while she made the caramel topping. This was the dangerous part. Sugar cooked to exactly 340 degrees, at which point it turns from amber syrup to bitter burn disaster in about 15 seconds. She'd pour the molten caramel onto the top layer quickly, spreading it smooth with an oiled spatula before it hardened. Then, while it was still slightly soft, she'd score it with a knife into serving portions, because once caramel fully hardened, you'd need a saw to cut through it. The finished Dobos torte was a masterpiece. 7 distinct layers visible when sliced, each separated by chocolate cream, topped with a sheet of amber caramel that shattered dramatically when you cut into it. Walk into Christmas afternoon 1960, when Grandma pulled out her special ring mold and announced she was making Savarin, and half the relatives had no idea what that meant, but everyone knew it would involve alcohol and impressive presentation. Savarin was a French yeast cake soaked in rum syrup, and making it properly required understanding how yeast worked, how to proof dough, how to bake it into a perfect ring, and how to soak it without making it soggy. In other words, this wasn't beginner baking. This was advanced technique disguised as simple cake. The dough started like brioche. Flour, butter, eggs, sugar, and yeast mixed together and kneaded until smooth and elastic. It had to rise twice, first in the bowl until doubled, then again in the ring mold until it filled the pan completely. The baking had to be precise. Too hot, and the outside would burn before the inside cooked through. Too cool, and it would be dense instead of light. Grandma had baked enough Savarins to know exactly when it was done by the smell and the golden color and the way it sounded when she tapped it. Once baked and cooled slightly, she'd turn it out onto a rimmed platter, and here's where the magic happened. The syrup was simple: sugar, water, and rum boiled together, but applying it required judgment that came from experience. She'd brush the syrup over the warm cake slowly, letting it absorb before adding more, turning the ring and brushing until the cake had soaked up every possible drop without becoming mushy. The rum flavor would penetrate throughout, and the cake would become shiny and sticky and intensely boozy. She'd fill the center of the ring with whipped cream, and around the base she'd arrange fresh strawberries if it was summer, or candied cherries if it was Christmas. The whole presentation was impressive: a golden ring cake, glazed with syrup, piled with cream, garnished with fruit. When you sliced into it, the texture was soft and moist, almost pudding-like from all that syrup, and the rum flavor was strong enough that children weren't allowed to have any. This was adult dessert, sophisticated dessert, French dessert made by an American grandmother who'd never been to France but had studied enough cookbooks to execute their techniques perfectly. Step back to Christmas 1959, when Grandma decided to make the richest, most decadent chocolate dessert she could find, and she landed on Marquise au Chocolat, a French frozen dessert that was basically chocolate and butter and eggs transformed into something that tasted like frozen truffle mousse. This wasn't ice cream. This wasn't mousse. This was pure chocolate luxury, in a form that required no ice cream maker but plenty of patience and very cold refrigerator space. The recipe came from a magazine article about Parisian restaurants, and Grandma clipped it out and saved it for months before attempting it because she wanted to make sure she had all the right ingredients and enough time to do it properly. The base was melted dark chocolate mixed with softened butter until it formed a smooth, glossy paste. Then came egg yolks beaten with sugar until they turned pale and thick, folded into the chocolate mixture carefully so the air wouldn't deflate. Finally, egg whites beaten to stiff peaks, folded in with the lightest possible touch. The mixture would be poured into a loaf pan lined with parchment paper, then frozen solid for at least 12 hours. The result was dense, but somehow also airy, intensely chocolatey, but not quite fudge, somewhere between frozen mousse and truffle filling. On Christmas Day, she'd unmold it onto a serving platter, peel off the parchment, and dust it with cocoa powder. Then came the slicing, which required a knife dipped in hot water and wiped clean between each cut, because the Marquise was so rich it would stick to everything it touched. Each slice was thin, maybe half an inch, because anything more would be overwhelming. You'd eat it slowly, letting it melt on your tongue, tasting the layers of chocolate flavor that seemed to go on forever. This was the dessert that proved chocolate could be sophisticated, that it wasn't just for children and cake, that when treated with respect and proper technique, it could become something worthy of the finest restaurants in Paris. Marquise au Chocolat required expensive chocolate, lots of eggs, real butter, and a freezer that worked reliably, all things that not every household had in 1959. It also required the confidence to attempt a recipe with a French name and no pictures, just trusting that if you followed the instructions precisely, something magical would happen. 5 desserts left, and these are the ones that required everything Grandma had learned over 50 years of Christmas baking. These are the recipes she only made when she wanted to prove something, when she needed to show that ordinary women with ordinary kitchens could create extraordinary things if they had enough skill and determination. Number 27 will make you understand exactly why losing these recipes means losing something irreplaceable. Stay until the end. You need to see this. Go back to Christmas 1963, the year Grandma saw a picture of a Croquembouche in a magazine, a towering pyramid of cream puffs held together with caramel topped with spun sugar, and decided she was going to make one for Christmas, even though everyone told her she was crazy. That Croquembouche required professional pastry chef skills that she'd never be able to pull it off in a home kitchen. Grandma took that as a challenge, not a warning. She spent 3 weeks practicing cream puffs until she could make them perfectly every time, light, hollow, crispy on the outside, ready to be filled with cream. Then she practiced caramel until she could cook it to exactly the right temperature without burning it. Finally, on Christmas Eve day, she attempted the full construction. She made 50 cream puffs that morning, each one perfect and identical. While they cooled, she made pastry cream from scratch, egg yolks, sugar, milk, cornstarch, vanilla, cooking it until thick and smooth. Using a piping bag with a narrow tip, she filled each cream puff through a small hole in the bottom, working carefully so they wouldn't crack or deflate. The filled puffs went back onto trays, and then came the terrifying part, the assembly. She'd need to work with molten caramel, dipping each cream puff and sticking it to the others to build a pyramid, and caramel at the right temperature was hot enough to cause serious burns if she made one mistake. She cooked the caramel to exactly 340 degrees, then began building from the bottom, arranging cream puffs in a circle, dipping the sides in caramel and pressing them together to form a ring. Another ring on top of that, slightly smaller. Then another, smaller still. Building upward into a cone shape, her hands moved fast, dipping and placing, the caramel cooling slightly between batches, so she had to reheat it carefully. After an hour of intense focus, the pyramid stood complete, maybe 18 inches tall, golden brown cream puffs held together with amber caramel. The final touch was spun sugar, cooking more caramel, then using 2 forks to fling thin streams of sugar back and forth over the pyramid until it was draped in golden threads that looked like angel hair. The finished croquembouche was stunning, looking like something from a French patisserie window, and when she carried it to the table, everyone applauded. Cutting into it meant breaking through caramel and cream puffs, and each person got several puffs filled with cream and coated with crunchy caramel. It was sweet and impressive and required skills that took years to develop. Grandma made it once, proved she could do it, and never made it again because she didn't need to prove anything twice. Walk into Grandma's kitchen 2 days before Christmas, 1961, when she was attempting what might be the most technically difficult cake in French pastry, opera cake, with 6 layers of almond sponge cake soaked in coffee syrup, layered with coffee buttercream and chocolate ganache, topped with chocolate glaze, so shiny you could see your reflection in it. This wasn't a recipe from Betty Crocker. This came from a French pastry book that Grandma had special ordered from a bookstore in the city, and the instructions assumed you already knew advanced techniques that most home bakers had never heard of. But Grandma was determined, had 2 full days to work on it, and was willing to fail spectacularly if that's what it took to learn. Day 1 was baking the 3 thin layers of Joconde, almond sponge cake that had to be spread onto sheet pans exactly a 1/4 inch thick, baked until just set, then cut into precise rectangles. The cake was made with almond flour, which she'd ground herself from blanched almonds, and beaten egg whites that had to be folded in carefully to keep the air. While the cake layers cooled, she made coffee syrup for soaking, chocolate ganache from cream and dark chocolate, and coffee buttercream from butter, sugar, and strong espresso beaten together for 20 minutes until light and fluffy. Day 2 was assembly, and this required steady hands and patience. She'd place the first cake layer on a board, brush it generously with coffee syrup, spread it with a thin layer of coffee buttercream, add another cake layer, brush with syrup, spread with ganache, add the third cake layer, more syrup, more buttercream. The whole construction was then chilled until firm. The final step was the chocolate glaze. Chocolate and butter melted together until smooth and shiny, then poured over the top of the chilled cake and spread quickly before it set. The glaze had to be perfectly smooth, perfectly shiny, with no bubbles or streaks. When it was done, opera cake looked like something from a high-end French patisserie. Layers visible from the side, shiny chocolate top, precise right angles at every corner. Slicing it revealed stripes of cake, cream, and ganache, and the taste was sophisticated and intense. Coffee, chocolate, almond, butter, all balanced perfectly. Each bite was different depending on which layer you hit first. This dessert took 2 full days, professional-level skills, and the kind of determination that wouldn't accept failure. Grandma made it once to prove she could execute the most difficult French cake in existence, using nothing but a regular home kitchen and willpower. That's the kind of woman she was. If someone said it couldn't be done, she'd do it just to prove them wrong. Step back to Christmas 1957, when Grandma decided that dessert should be beautiful as well as delicious, and she spent an entire afternoon piping meringue into swan shapes that would become the centerpiece of the dessert table and make every guest stop and stare before taking a single bite. Meringue swans weren't a single dessert. They were individual servings, each one a work of art that required piping skills most home bakers would never develop. But Grandma had been decorating cakes for decades, and her piping skills were professional level, even though she'd never worked in a bakery. The process started with making perfect meringue. Egg whites beaten with cream of tartar until foamy, then sugar added gradually, while beating until the meringue formed stiff, glossy peaks that held their shape indefinitely. She'd divide the meringue between multiple piping bags fitted with different tips, one for the swan bodies, one for the wings, one for the necks and heads. On parchment-lined baking sheets, she'd pipe the bodies first, large ovals of meringue about 3 inches long, then the wings, shaped like teardrops with ridges piped on to look like feathers. Finally, the necks and heads, piped in a graceful S-curve with a small dollop at the top for the head. Everything went into a very low oven, 200 degrees, to dry out slowly for 2 hours. This wasn't baking, it was drying, and the goal was to turn the meringue crispy and white without any browning. When they came out, the pieces would be completely dry and crispy, ready for assembly. On Christmas Day, she'd assemble each swan individually. The oval body would be cut in half horizontally, the bottom half spread with whipped cream, the top half cut in 2 to form wings that would be stuck into the cream at an angle. The neck would be inserted into the front, standing upright and proud. Each completed swan sat on a pool of raspberry sauce on individual plates, and they looked like they were swimming in a pink pond. Guests would almost feel guilty destroying something so beautiful by eating it, but once they did, the combination of crispy meringue, soft whipped cream, and tart raspberry sauce made them glad they'd overcome their hesitation. Meringue swans proved that dessert could be art, that home bakers could create restaurant-quality presentations if they had the skills and patience. Grandma made them because she could, because she wanted Christmas dessert to be memorable for its appearance as well as its taste, because she understood that sometimes food is about more than just flavor. It's about creating moments of beauty and wonder that people remember for decades. Go back to Christmas 1959, when Grandma attempted what French pastry chefs consider one of the most difficult desserts in their entire repertoire, Gâteau Saint-Honoré, named after the patron saint of bakers, a dessert that combined puff pastry, choux pastry, pastry cream, and caramelized cream puffs into a single impressive creation that required mastering 4 different techniques and executing them all perfectly in the right sequence. This wasn't a recipe you attempted casually. This was a recipe that professional bakers failed at regularly. But Grandma had decided that if French pastry chefs could make it, she could too. And she wasn't going to let something like extreme difficulty stop her from trying. She started with puff pastry made from scratch, butter folded into dough repeatedly to create hundreds of layers that would puff up into flaky sheets when baked. This took hours of rolling and folding and chilling, but she'd made puff pastry before and knew the rhythm of it. Once the puff pastry was resting, she made choux pastry, the same dough used for cream puffs, and piped it into small puffs and a ring that would sit on top of the puff pastry base. While those baked, she made crème pâtissière, classic pastry cream, and also crème chibouste, a lightened version made by folding Italian meringue into the pastry cream. This alone required making sugar syrup and beating egg whites simultaneously, timing everything so the hot syrup could be poured into the whites at exactly the right moment. The assembly was complex. Bake the puff pastry round until golden and crispy. Pipe a ring of choux around the edge and bake again until the choux puffed up. Fill the center with crème chibouste. Dip the small choux puffs in caramel and stick them around the top edge of the ring, creating a crown. Pipe rosettes of more crème chibouste between the puffs. The finished gâteau was elaborate and impressive, with multiple textures: crispy puff pastry, soft cream, crunchy caramel, light choux puffs, and the taste was pure French elegance. Grandma made Gâteau Saint-Honoré exactly once, on Christmas 1959, but she kept the recipe card in her box, and sometimes she'd take it out and look at it and remember the year she made the patron saint of bakers proud by executing his namesake dessert perfectly in a small-town American kitchen with one oven and no professional equipment. That memory of attempting something impossibly difficult and succeeding meant more to her than any compliment anyone ever gave her. It proved that skill and determination could overcome any obstacle, that ordinary women were capable of extraordinary things if they believed in themselves enough to try. Walk into Grandma's kitchen on December 20th, 1964, when she decided that her final Christmas as primary family baker, she was getting older, her hands hurt from arthritis, and next year someone else would need to take over, would be marked by making the most ambitious dessert she'd ever attempted, a pièce montée, a French showpiece dessert that was more sculpture than food, traditionally made for weddings but perfectly appropriate for a farewell Christmas. A pièce montée was a tower of profiteroles, small cream puffs, stacked high and held together with caramel, decorated with spun sugar, marzipan flowers, and anything else that made it look impressive and celebratory. There was no single recipe. It was a concept, a technique, an art form that required every baking skill she'd accumulated over 50 years of making Christmas desserts. She spent 3 days on it. Day 1 was making and filling 100 profiteroles. tiny cream puffs, each one perfectly round, baked until crispy, cooled, then filled with vanilla pastry cream through a small hole in the bottom. Day 2 was making decorations, marzipan roses in red and white, chocolate leaves painted with cocoa butter, caramel ribbons formed by drizzling hot caramel onto a marble slab. Day 3 was assembly, and this was where decades of experience became essential. She'd cook caramel to exactly the right temperature, hot enough to stick and hold, cool enough not to melt the cream inside the profiteroles, then dip each one and stack them in a spiral, building upward into a cone shape that stood nearly 2 feet tall. Grandma never made another pièce montée. That was her finale, her farewell to 5 decades of Christmas baking, her proof that she'd mastered every technique worth mastering. The next year, my mother took over Christmas desserts, and they were good, but never quite the same. Nobody had Grandma's skills, her confidence, her willingness to attempt impossible things just to prove they could be done. When she died in 1972, her recipe box passed to my mother, and eventually to me, and I have the card for pièce montée written in her handwriting. I've never attempted it. I don't have her skills or her courage. But I keep the card anyway because it reminds me that ordinary women who lived ordinary lives were capable of creating extraordinary beauty if they cared enough to try. So there they are, 30 Christmas desserts from the Betty Crocker era, made by grandmothers who understood that the sweet finale to Christmas dinner mattered as much as the meal itself, that dessert was where you showed off your skills, where you proved that sugar and butter and eggs and patience could create moments of beauty and wonder that people would remember for decades. I close my eyes and I'm back in that kitchen, watching Grandma's flour-dusted hands work through complicated techniques, seeing her face concentrate as she piped meringue or folded cream or watched caramel cook to exactly the right temperature. She made it look easy because she'd done it so many times, but I remember the early attempts she'd tell stories about, the cakes that fell, the meringues that wept, the caramel that burned, the cream puffs that didn't puff. She failed countless times before she succeeded, but failure never stopped her from trying again. That persistence, that willingness to learn from mistakes, defined her generation. These 30 desserts weren't just sweets. They were proof that ordinary women with ordinary kitchens could master professional-level techniques if they practiced long enough. They were insurance against boring holidays, guarantees that Christmas would feel special even when money was tight. They were how grandmothers showed love without saying words, how they impressed guests without bragging, how they passed down skills to daughters and granddaughters who were paying attention. Every meringue swan taught piping skills. Every layered Bavarian cream taught patience. Every piece of caramel work taught respect for temperature and timing. These weren't just desserts. They were lessons disguised as sweets. Now they're almost gone. The recipes still exist, tucked into old Betty Crocker cookbooks and handwritten recipe cards in boxes nobody looks through anymore. Recipes are just words without the techniques that make them work, and those techniques are dying with the grandmothers who practiced them. Young people don't make Charlotte Russe because they don't know what it is. They don't attempt opera cake because it seems too difficult. They don't even try because they've never seen anyone succeed, and without examples of success, most people won't attempt difficult things. But here's what I know. These desserts are waiting. The recipes exist. The ingredients are available. Everything required to make them still exists, except the knowledge and the confidence. You can bring that back. You can learn one of these desserts. Start simple, maybe ribbon Jell-O or ambrosia. Work your way up. Try snow pudding. Eventually attempt the difficult ones. Opera cake, croquembouche, pieces montée. Yes, you'll fail sometimes. Yes, your first meringue might weep, or your first caramel might burn. That's how learning works. Grandma failed too, repeatedly. before she mastered these techniques. But she kept trying because she understood that mastery is worth pursuing, even when it's difficult. These desserts represent a way of thinking that's vanishing. The idea that difficult things are worth attempting, that failure is part of learning, that skills developed over decades have value that can't be measured in time or money. When we lose these recipes, we lose proof that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. We lose the understanding that grandmothers in small-town kitchens were capable of creating desserts as impressive as anything from French patisseries. We lose the memory that women without formal training could master professional-level techniques through nothing but practice and determination. Don't let that happen. Pick one dessert from this list. Find someone old enough to remember how it's really done, or find a detailed recipe and follow it precisely. Make it this Christmas. Taste the past. Honor the skill. Remember that our grandmothers were capable of creating beauty from butter and sugar and eggs, and that capability doesn't have to die with them. The recipes are waiting. The techniques can be relearned. All that's missing is someone willing to try. That could be you. Make it be you before it's too late. Before the last grandmother who made these desserts dies and takes the knowledge with her into the ground. Before these 30 desserts become nothing but words in old cookbooks that nobody reads. Before we forget completely what Christmas desserts used to be, not just sweet endings to meals, but proof that ordinary women were capable of extraordinary things. This Christmas, remember, this Christmas, bake. This Christmas, bring back something worth saving before the sweetness disappears forever.